Today is June 3, 2018. We are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread of the second month and have been discussing the historicity of the Exodus and in particular claimed Mosaic documents within the Pentateuch. And we are studying this both to find out what happened and how it relates to the character of our Heavenly Family. So before we get back in, let's ask our Heavenly Family to help us to understand. Heavenly Family, thank you once again for bringing us here to meet together and to discuss these important topics. Help us to find the truth and to test all things and to hold fast to that which is good and to be willing to let go of that which is not good. Please help us to be rid of our biases and preconceptions. Help us to deal with reality on its own terms and to do so in love both for each other and for the truth. Please, Heavenly Family, we really do want to have minds and bodies which operate only according to truth and love. So guide us through this whole investigation, and we thank you for leading us so far. We ask this, B'Shem Tzemach. Amen.
Amen.
So as a brief reminder as to where we are at, how we got here, and why we are doing what we're doing, we are studying the historicity of the Exodus partly because we have come to realize that it would be wrong to take for granted as true the stories that we were taught either growing up or when joining a certain religious group, especially since in either scenario, we, along with most people who have believed in the Bible, have done so without actually having tested its claims. Typically, people accept the Bible by tradition, and that is accepting certain doctrines that are put forward by a community, and then in joining that community or in being raised in that community, accepting the writings which often lay, at least in some sense, at its foundation. Many people do this without even ever having read those writings, nonetheless tested them. And we have to acknowledge this as a reality, not to accuse people, because we ourselves have done precisely the same thing. I know that I have. And I've actually done both of them. I was raised with the Protestant canon and believed it, and then I departed for a while. And then when I, came back into, I guess being a believing Christian or something like that, I, at that point, accepted those writings, not because I was raised with them just in and of itself. No, I accepted them at that point because, well, it's the Bible, and I believe in Jesus now, and I guess this is it. This is what it's like, and this is what's involved. People just don't often question that because it's presented as kind of part of the package. And we've come to realize that that package is certainly a late on the scene package, particularly when it comes to the Protestant canon. The earliest reference in history to the Protestant canon as we now know it being the Bible, as in the first reference in history to the Bible being composed of the 66 books which currently compose the Protestant canon, was in the year 1559 AD by John Calvin. It's in the French Confession of Faith. Prior to that, this package that we think of as the Bible did not exist in a form in which most of us think of it. There are, in fact, other packages that include other writings. And we have come to see that none of these packages, these biblical canons, as they are called, are actually justifiable, nor are they heaven ordained, nor are they helpful, nor is the idea of a biblical canon helpful. It has many negative consequences, in fact, which we've discussed in many other studies, so I won't go into that here and now. But I will mention that we've learned that it's important both to be open to accepting the legitimacy of writings that were not included in biblical canons, and we also ought to be willing to questioning the validity of writings that are within biblical canons. Now, not only do we need to question the legitimacy of the writings themselves, but we also ought to question the traditional claims concerning them. For example, with the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, a very, very common claim is that they were written by Moses. That's not a claim that those writings themselves actually make. It's just a claim that religious devotees, either Jews or Christians, make concerning Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, we have found that that claim is actually unsubstantiated, and more than that, it's not true. The claim cannot be true. Moses could not have written the Torah, the Pentateuch. All of the evidence suggests that the authorship of the Torah is best understood as being the product of multiple individuals writing at different times, none of whom were Moses. So this obviously changes how we view the Torah and its stories, and we've learned about the documentary hypothesis, which actually gives an explanation, at least generally speaking, of who the authors of the Torah were, and the 4 primary authors and the texts by which they are represented are referred to by the letters J, E, P, and D. We've been testing this hypothesis for some time. So far, it's standing very well. And in reading the various accounts within the Pentateuch regarding the Exodus, we have found that they present sometimes conflicting pictures, which raises the question of historicity. And we really want to know what historically happened and what actually did not happen, but is claimed to happen, because this is an event in which it is claimed that Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, acted, and it is an event which is pointed back to in many of the Israelite writings. It's a huge event that is really, in many Israelite writings, one of the chief identifiers of Yahweh. Yahweh is Yahweh who brought you up and delivered you from the land of Egypt. There are many passages in Israelite writings which say things along those lines, thus making the Exodus a very important event for us to investigate, especially since some of the portrayals of Yahweh in connection with the Exodus claim that at the Exodus, or in connection with it, Yahweh endorsed and commanded slavery, Yahweh commanded genocide, infanticide, the slaughtering of animals, and there's probably more that could be added to that list, but there's quite a lot of pretty awful stuff that is attributed to Yahweh in connection with the Exodus. And of course, we found that the heavenly family who is leading us and who is educating us have a character that's radically different from the character which is placed upon Yahweh in some of these passages that relate to the Exodus. Now, since Moses is supposed to be Yahweh's prophet or spokesperson during the Exodus, it's important for us to accurately understand the historical Moses, because Moses was the one who was bearing Yahweh's message. So what we have been doing in our most recent studies is looking at the few passages within the Torah which mention and even quote writings which are claimed by the authors of the Pentateuchal sources to have been written by Moses. Again, for sake of clarity, it's not that any of these sources are claiming themselves to be written by Moses. J doesn't claim to be written by Moses, neither does E, P, or D. None of the editors claim to be Moses. But J, for example, mentions a text which J says Moses wrote. And J quotes the words of that text. Likewise, E does the same thing. And so does D. And so does the redactor. And in total, there are 6 places in the combined Torah where one of its authors refers to a document which it claims Moses to have written. And at least 5 of those 6 instances actually contain quotations, potentially in full, of the document which it is claimed Moses wrote. So we have looked at the first 2 such instances. Both of them are found in the book Exodus, and both of them are from the E source. The first is in Exodus 17:14, which claims Moses to have written something regarding the Amalekites. And then the next one is in Exodus 20 through 24, and the E text here, particularly in chapter 24, verses 4 and 7, says that Moses wrote down the words that Yahweh spoke to him, and in the context, Yahweh spoke to Moses words that are now contained in Exodus chapter 20, verse 22, through Exodus 23, verse 33. So it may be that the E source is claiming that Moses wrote all of that content, all of those words of Yahweh, and then the E source is quoting that Mosaic document. Alternatively, it could be that the source behind the words now contained in E did not contain the content of Exodus 20, verse 22 to Exodus 23, verse 33. Instead, it may simply be the content of Exodus 21, verse 2, or verse 1, to Exodus 23, verse 19. So that's a smaller section within the broader range of verses. This smaller section is strictly listing commands. It's giving laws. Whereas the broader section, in addition to laws, also contains different statements regarding, the angel of Yahweh and how he will be with the children of Israel, and different statements like that, and about going into the land and conquering the nations in the land of Canaan, those sorts of things. So it could be that originally the list of laws circulated separately, and then additional material was added to it, and then the E source is claiming the whole thing to have been written by Moses, or something else. Those are some of the possibilities that we need to consider and investigate. So we read that whole section in yesterday's meeting and discussed a little bit about it. The last thing that we discussed was the question of whether this document, which the e-source is quoting, if it claims to have been written by Moses. And what we found is that no, it doesn't. In fact, it doesn't even mention Moses. And so we would really have to find some sort of external verification for the idea that it was written by Moses if we are to even take that hypothesis seriously, because again, it doesn't make the claim. So perhaps we could spend a little bit more time discussing this section in Exodus chapter 20 to 24, if there are further comments or questions regarding it. But again, it would be good to also move on to the next instances, since we really do want to kind of take a look at all of them. So I have at least one other comment regarding the scroll of the covenant, this document in Exodus 20 to 23. But if anyone else has any comments first, please voice it. So I guess just from now, within the next 10 seconds, if you have a comment or a question regarding the scroll of the covenant, feel free to voice it. And if no one says anything, then I'll make a comment. All right. So the other comment that I have is that in looking at this covenant scroll, the scroll of the covenant, there are at least a few features of it that at least might indicate that this document itself is not one composition by one person at one time. Rather, it may be a compilation of different laws which originated at different times from different people, in which case it wouldn't ultimately, as a whole, be of Mosaic origin necessarily. So the first thing that I want to mention is the laws regarding slavery. It's kind of interesting. In Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 and 21, it says, and I quote, "And if a man will strike his slave or his maid with a rod, and he dies by his hand, he will be punished. But if he lives for a day or 2 days, he will not be punished, because he is his property." Now, that's kind of striking. Like, okay, so if someone hits their slave and their slave dies, then the master of the slave who beat their slave should be punished. But if the master beats their slave and their slave doesn't die within a day or two, then the master won't be punished because the slave is their property. Okay, so that obviously is a totally immoral law, a law which promotes ideas to which we strongly object. I would hope that everyone here strongly objects to a law like that. But then a little bit later, just a few verses later, Exodus 21, verse 26 and 27. Listen to what it says here. "And if a man will strike his slave's eye or his maid's eye and destroy it, he shall let him go free, liberated, because of his eye. And if he will knock out his slave's tooth or his maid's tooth, he shall let him go free, liberated, because of his tooth." Okay, so this is really odd. A few verses earlier, it was saying if someone beats their slave, just so long as their slave doesn't die within a couple days, then the master won't be punished. But in this verse, it's saying if the master strikes them, and this is, a far lesser thing than dying, if they destroy their eye or if they knock out their tooth, which is, again, pretty minor in comparison to them dying or being beaten to the point of almost being dead. Just knocking out your slave's tooth, according to this law, you have to let your slave go free. So even though this law still was in the context of slavery, which is basically universal in the ancient world, it's highly favorable to the slave. It's like, if you're going to mistreat a slave, you don't get to have a slave. That's kind of the idea. That slave goes free if they get mistreated. It doesn't say then you have to sell them even. It's saying they go free. That's actually really revolutionary in the ancient world. But those two laws seem to contradict each other. I mean, what happens if you beat your slave and they don't die and their tooth happens to fall out, or whatever other part of their body? Obviously, it's giving multiple body parts getting damaged as examples, but presumably it could be any body part. So what happens? According to one law, nothing happens. You just keep them as your slave. They're your property. You don't get punished. But in the other law, you have to let them go free. So these two laws seem to contradict each other, which would seem to indicate that they were not written by the same person at the same time. Furthermore, within this scroll of the covenant, there seems to be doublets. For example, Exodus 22, verse 20 says, "And you shall not persecute a foreigner, and you shall not oppress him, because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt." And then later, in chapter 23, verse 9, it says, "And you shall not oppress a foreigner, since you know the foreigner's soul, because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt." I mean, yeah, very slight different wording, but it's essentially the same law. Why repeat that twice within the same list of laws? Doesn't quite make sense. So those sorts of things seem to at least be open to the interpretation that this is a compilation of different laws. I think it actually does indicate that this is a compilation of different laws by different people at different times. Another thing which seems to indicate that is something which Teresa mentioned, and that is that many of the laws here are actually simply restatements or copies of laws from earlier law codes, like the law code of Hammurabi, which dates probably to the 18th or 17th centuries BCE, certainly before this law code. And there's actually lots of different examples of this. And apparently it's not just that. It's not just Hammurabi's law code. Apparently, this covenant code in the e-source contains laws that are from other ancient law codes of the ancient Near East. Now, with that said, it seems to be that this is, again, a compilation of different laws from different sources, composed at different times, some of them predating Israel. So I'll make a statement, it might seem quite obvious, but maybe it's not so obvious. And that is that a law which predates Moses could not have originated with Moses. Mm-hmm. So if you have laws here from Hammurabi's law code from the 18th century BCE, and if Moses only lived in, let's say, the 15th or 13th century BCE, which are the two most common dates, although it varies among scholars as to when exactly Moses would have lived if he lived, but almost all scholars would agree that Moses lived after the time of Hammurabi if they think he lived. And so, really, again, since we have parallels to Hammurabi's law code, since we have parallels to other ancient Near Eastern law codes, it seems to be a compilation of different law codes, and I would say that the only laws which have potential to have Mosaic origin are those which do not have pre-Mosaic origin. Mm-hmm. So this is really helpful. We have a lot of these ancient Near Eastern texts that are freely available on the internet. Just type in onto Google ancient Near Eastern law codes or something like that, You can find Hammurabi's law code and other ancient Near Eastern law codes and just read them and read what we find here in this law code in Exodus 20 through 23. And you can note the parallels, and that which you find to actually just be repeats of older law codes that are pre-Moses, did not originate with Moses. Now, it's not saying that Moses didn't know about them and that Moses didn't repeat some of them. It's possible that Moses may have knew some of them and repeated them, but even if that's the case, we can know that that wasn't part of the message which our Heavenly Family gave to Moses, because a prophet's message is what they are saying that is unique and distinct as compared to what came before them and what was present in their own time. So basically, we can say that there certainly is a lot within the covenant code here in the e-source, which is not of Mosaic origin, and that does include many of the laws regarding slavery and some laws regarding animals and different things like that. But there are some laws here which do not have any ancient Near Eastern parallels. And then we have to ask the question, where did those laws come from? And we should at least entertain the possibility that maybe some of those laws did come from Moses. Because if there really was a Moses, and if that Moses really was a hugely influential figure in the history of Israel, as would seem to be indicated by all the texts that we know of that refer to Moses, then one would think that if he gave any laws, they would have influenced Israel at some point. And when we look at some of these laws, like, okay, we have laws like you shall not oppress a foreigner. These are laws which acknowledge human rights for foreigners. According to Richard Elliott Friedman, at least, these laws do not have ancient Near Eastern parallels. You don't find in Babylonian law codes or Egyptian law codes or any other law codes the idea that you should treat foreigners well. There weren't laws protecting foreigners. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and this is something which is widespread in Israelite literature. Is it possible that that particular command actually did go back to Moses? Possible. And I will say Richard Elliott Friedman's hypothesis regarding a Levite Exodus would actually lean in that direction, because it proposes that Levites, rather than being a tribal community that originated from a certain patriarch, as in they're all children of one particular man, rather they were outsiders of society, both in Egypt and in Canaan. And thus, they might, by going through hardships as outsiders and foreigners in another land, they might actually develop laws, or Moses among them as one of them. It would make sense to come to understand through those circumstances that it's important to care for people who are foreigners in your land, because they would have undergone that mistreatment. So it kind of makes sense if Moses was one of these Levites who was a foreigner in the land. Historically speaking, it's at least a reasonable hypothesis that a law like this might go back to Moses. Laws for Sabbath observance. It's kind of interesting how in the covenant code here in the e-source, the Sabbath observance law is actually generally positive. It's just, again, I'll read it. It's Exodus 23, verse 12. 6 days you shall do the things you do, and on the seventh day you shall cease, so that your ox and your ass will rest, and your maid's son and the foreigner will be refreshed. So it's generally just positive for everyone. And the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath is something that, to my knowledge, was unique among the Israelites. I don't know of any Sabbatarian laws among pre-Israelite Canaanites or among Egyptians or Babylonians or Akkadians or Sumerians or whatever other ancient Near Eastern culture we might think of. So with that in mind, this covenant code may in fact contain some laws that do go back to Moses, and maybe some of them do relate to an Exodus. And it's interesting that the Sabbath command, not here, but in Deuteronomy, is connected with the Exodus, and the foreigner command is explicitly connected with the Exodus here in the covenant code. So it's kind of interesting how some of the laws which do not have parallel to pre-existing ancient Near Eastern law codes have some sort of connection with the Exodus. That's kind of interesting. Maybe that does give some legitimization to the idea that some of these laws may go back to Moses. Anyway, that's all for consideration. Sorry, someone's commenting here. One moment. Okay, go ahead.
Now I'm curious to know if if there's any animal sacrifice laws that might point back to the Near Eastern code laws and the Hammurabi code laws. Just curious now.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting question, and actually,
I don't remember any.
But
sacrificial laws in the Hammurabi.
Yeah, in my looking into the Hammurabi law code as well, I don't remember sacrificial laws. But I will say, I think it was earlier today, at some point recently anyway, I've been trying to listen to more of these lectures from the UCSD Exodus conference. And I think it was in William Dever's lecture. I think he mentioned that much of the ancient Israelite sacrificial system has parallels in the Ugaritic sacrificial system that we know from their literature. So that's a lot of the pre-Israelite Canaanite stuff. And yeah, I know that there are some parallels. Like there is something that's like a Feast of Tabernacles there. There's also rituals recorded in Ugaritic literature that are very similar to the rituals of the Day of Atonement in Israelite literature. So there are actually a lot of parallels, and that would seem to indicate that those laws, since some of them have pre-Mosaic origins, that they didn't have Mosaic origins. Now, again, it's not to say that because something doesn't have Mosaic origins, that it doesn't have divine origins, because our Heavenly Family was speaking to humanity prior to the time of Moses. So it's not to say that they couldn't have inspired other things, but we are specifically looking at what can we trace back to Moses, what can we determine about the message of our Heavenly Family in the context of and in connection with the Exodus. So the other questions are worthy of being dealt with as well, as to a law, irrespective of whether it had Mosaic origins, did it have divine origins? But again, we're dealing with the Moses thing, and we couldn't say that every law of pre-Mosaic origin had divine origin. Okay, and then you had a comment as well?
Well, yeah, I was just, while you were talking there a few minutes ago, I was reading up some on, just skimming the Code of Hammurabi because I had pulled up to make sure of the date, and it is, like mid-1700s BC, so 18th century BC. But and I closed the tab already, but, there's the question that was asked, did Moses copy Hammurabi's law code? And whoever wrote the article that I was reading was kind of like, oh, while there's similarities, there's not all similarities. Hammurabi's law code only deals with judicial stuff, which I don't remember any religious stuff really in the law code of Hammurabi either, although he does say that he got the law code from the god Shamash, if I remember.
Yeah, I was going to say Shamash, right?
Yeah. So, but it doesn't talk about what to do about religious activities. It's just about civil actions. So because there are differences in Moses' law code, or what they would call Moses' law, their solution then is that no, Moses didn't copy anything from the law code of Hammurabi. That it doesn't make sense to say that just because there's some similarities, then he copied, and of course they use the word plagiarize as if that was even a thing back then. But like, no way that Moses copied the law code of Hammurabi. It's just repeating any kind of civil action that you would need to take place in a society, and, you know, justice for different people and that sort of thing. But I don't see that as reasonable at all.
Right, yeah, of course.
So it's like the, what's the name for the fallacy where you only have two options?
False dilemma.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and also it just simply doesn't follow, like that type of reasoning that, oh, just because there are differences means that the similarities could not be due to copying. It doesn't actually make any sense.
It also stated something very, very too false dilemma-ish, as in, if Moses, I think I found it here. So, yeah, because the Mosaic Law contains some similarities to Hammurabi's code, some critics of the Bible, of course, they're saying that just critics of the Bible, some critics of the Bible believe that Moses copied from the Hammurabian code. If they're right and Moses simply stole from the Babylonians, they're really painting this in a very slanted way, and Moses simply stole from the Babylonians, then the whole episode at Mount Sinai is false, and the inspiration of Scripture is suspect. So very, very poor logic, very poor reasoning in this article. Quite a shame. And yeah, it's too bad, really. But knowing about the documentary hypothesis and knowing that it doesn't have to be so polarized in how we're investigating this really gives us the tools to be able to get to the bottom of it and to find out the truth.
Totally. So, you know, our MO for studying out this law code, I think, should be comparing it with other law codes, isolating the statements which are unique, and then those are the ones which we can more closely investigate to see if they actually do have Mosaic origins and they have something to tell us about the Exodus. So anyway, are there any other comments or questions on this law code, or are you guys ready to go to the next claimed Mosaic document within the Pentateuch?
So I'm ready for the next.
Me
okay,
too.
Excellent. All right, we will move on to the next one then. The next one is found in Exodus chapter 34, and this is actually in the J text, and it is J's version of the Ten Commandments, which, interestingly, is different from the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, which was included by the redactor, though it's not part of JEP or D, and it's also different from the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5, which, of course, is part of the D source. So in Exodus 34, verses 27 and 28, we find the following. And Yahweh said to Moses, write these words for yourself, because I've made a covenant with you and with Israel based on these words. And he was there with Yahweh 40 days and 40 nights. And he did not eat bread, and he did not drink water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. Okay, so in context, the words being referred to are the words of the prior context. These words are found really in Exodus 34, verses 14 to 26. That's where there's kind of a 10 Commandments. But we could go back even further to where Yahweh starts speaking in verse 10. So for a fuller context, I'd actually like to ask if someone could read from the beginning of the chapter in Exodus chapter 34, verse 1 through to verse 28. No need to go beyond that because then it goes into the P source. But Exodus 34, verses 1 to 28. Who would like to read that?
I will. Okay, Exodus 34, verse 1. And Yahweh said to Moses, carve 2 tablets of stones like the first ones, and I'll write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets which you shattered. And be ready for the morning, and you shall go up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. And no man shall go up with you, and also let no man be seen in all of the mountain. Also let the flock and the oxen not feed opposite that mountain. And he carved 2 tablets of stones like the first ones. And Moses got up early in the morning and went up to Mount Sinai as Yahweh had commanded him. And he took in his hand 2 tablets of stones. And Yahweh came down in a cloud and stood with him there, and he invoked the name Yahweh. And Yahweh passed in front of him and called, Yahweh, Yahweh, merciful and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in kindness and faithfulness, keeping kindness for thousands, bearing crime and offense of sin, though not making one innocent, reckoning father's crime on the children and on the children's children, on the 3rd and on the 4th generations. And Moses hurried and knelt to the ground and bowed, and he said, if I've found favor in your eyes, my Lord, may my Lord go among us, because it is a stiff-necked people, and forgive our crime and our sin, and make us your legacy. And he said, here, I'm making a covenant before all your people. I'll do wonders that haven't been created in all the earth and among all the nations. And all the people whom you're going will see Yahweh's deeds, because that which I'm doing with you is awesome. Watch yourself regarding what I command you today. Here, I'm driving out from before you the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Be careful of yourself that you don't make a covenant with the resident of the land unto which you are coming, that he doesn't become a trap among you. But you shall demolish their altars and shatter their pillars and cut down their Asherahs. For you shall not bow to another God, because Yahweh, his name, is jealous. He is a jealous God, that you may not make a covenant with the resident of the land, and that they will prostitute themselves after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and he will call to you, and you will eat from his sacrifice. And you will take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters will prostitute themselves after their gods, and cause your sons to prostitute themselves after their gods. You shall not make molten gods for yourself. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, which I commanded you at the appointed time in the month of Abib, because in the month of Abib you went out of Egypt. Every first birth of a womb is mine, and all your animals that have a male first birth, ox or sheep. And you shall redeem an ass's first birth with a sheep, and if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. You shall redeem every firstborn of your sons, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you shall cease. In plowing time and in harvest you shall cease. And you shall make a festival of weeks, of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the festival of gathering at the end of the year. 3 times in the year every one of your males shall appear before the Lord Yahweh, God of Israel. For I shall dispossess nations before you and widen your border, and no man will covet your land while you are going up to appear before Yahweh your God 3 times a year. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice unleavened bread, and the sacrifice of the festival of Passover shall not remain until morning. You shall bring your first of the firstfruits of your land to the house of Yahweh your God. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Yahweh said to Moses, write these words for yourself, because I've made a covenant with you and with Israel based on these words. And he was there with Yahweh 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread, and he did not drink water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for reading that. And I will just briefly mention a couple things. In the Bible with Sources Revealed, there are two places in the verses that we just read that evidently do not actually belong to the J source, and that is in verse 1 of the chapter when it says, and Yahweh said to Moses, carve 2 tablets of stone. Now the rest of the verse is thought to be the words of the redactor of J and E. So the person who combined J and E together put this together, or added this section in order to kind of harmonize them. So like the first ones, and I'll write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablet, which you shattered. So earlier in the combined Pentateuch, there is a shattering of 10 commandments, but in the J account, it doesn't actually have anything like that. And then in verse 4 again, there's a phrase like the first ones, which was presumably added by the redactor. Other than that, though, it seems to be straightforward J in everything that we just read. And at some point in this dialogue, it goes into listing commandments. And at the end, Moses is told to write them. And they are the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. This is actually where we get the phrase, the 10 commandments. I don't think the phrase even shows up in Exodus 20. I think there it calls them the 10 words. So in any case, does anyone have any initial comments or questions regarding this text?
Trent, can you please repeat just that last part about the words of the covenant and the 10 Commandments not being there or something? Please?
Sure. Yeah, I was just saying that the phrase, the 10 commandments, actually comes from this verse, Exodus chapter 34, verse 28. I don't even think the phrase occurs in Exodus 20, which is where people usually go to find, quote unquote, the 10 commandments. But in Exodus 20, if I remember correctly, it does not call them the 10 commandments. It calls them the 10 words. So it's just kind of interesting when people print out a list of the 10 commandments. They never print out the one here in Exodus 34, and this is the one where it's actually called the 10 Commandments.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It's interesting that looks like Moses wrote on the tablets of stone and not God in this one.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting difference.
Yeah, except for the part where the redactor adds that, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I also had another comment here. I see a potential discrepancy, in, I don't remember which source, but in one source, or at least in Joshua, you have the account of totally wiping out the inhabitants of the land. And probably, I just don't remember where everything's at, but do you remember if it's the case that in the Pentateuch that Yahweh is attributed to saying that he will wipe them out completely?
I think so.
I kind of thought so too, but this is really interesting because verse 11, Yahweh is speaking to Moses and says, obey what I am commanding you this day. I'm going to drive out before you the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Be careful not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it become a snare among you. Rather, you must destroy their altars, smash their images, and cut down their Asherah poles. And then he goes on to say not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone invites you, you will eat from his sacrifice. And then you will take his daughters for your sons, and when his daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will make your sons prostitute themselves to their gods as well. You must not make yourselves molten gods. Doesn't say anything about killing everybody.
Yeah, that's interesting. In this account, it doesn't say anything about a genocide.
In fact, quite the opposite. It's assuming there's going to be inhabitants living there from those nations, and that the Israelites or those leaving in the Exodus need to be really careful that they don't join in with the ceremonies in worshiping these other gods of those nations and not intermarrying. It assumes the people are going to be there.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I'll also add to that in the covenant code back in Exodus 23, when it talks about the angel, my angel will go ahead of you. In Exodus 23, verse 23, it said, when my angel will go ahead of you and will bring you to the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Canaanite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, and I obliterate them, you shall not bow to their gods.
Yeah, okay, so it does in the Pentateuch speak about wiping everyone out.
Yeah, and then later it says in verse 28, and I shall send the hornet ahead of you, and it will drive out the Hivite and the Canaanite and the Hittite.
But this is still the source that says it'll be done little by little.
Yeah. So the E-source has them obliterated little by little. The J-source has them driven out little by little. And I forget if it's P or D or both that has them just being massacred.
Now, where does J have them driven out little by little?
Well, basically, in what we just...
Oh, yeah. I'm going to drive out before you.
Yeah, I'm going to drive out. And it kind of implies that it's little by little because obviously they're still in the land with them, interacting with them. So it's not giving the picture that they're driven all out ahead of time and then they go into an uninhabited land.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, another question for everyone here. Does the text of the Ten Commandments within J claim to have been written by Moses? Again, it's quite clear that J is claiming that Moses wrote this list of 10 commandments, but do we have any claim from within them that Moses wrote them?
Nope.
Yeah, I agree. There's no claim here from within them that Moses wrote them. Does anyone else have any comments or questions regarding this text?
I was just curious if you could comment on verse 13. What does that mean? Okay, so, but you shall demolish their altars and shatter their pillars and cut down their Asherahs. What was Asherahs again?
An Asherah was an idol of the goddess Asherah. So basically, it was just a pole that was representing Asherah, the goddess.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
So basically, this passage depicts destroying both male and female deity altars and idols and images.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that.
Which is interesting because years ago, I used to take this sort of thing as some kind of evidence against the existence of any true female goddess, well, that's redundant, female god.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to think of which logical fallacy this would be. And it was on the tip of my tongue, but where, like special pleading maybe that's not exactly it, but where you can use an argument, or where you try to use an argument against one thing, but it's not consistent. You're not using.
You make an exception.
Yeah, for sure.
Special pleading, yeah.
Yeah, so if this is supposed to be some evidence against worshiping a female deity, it should also be evidence against worshiping any male deity. It doesn't have any bearing on the existence of male or female deities. It's just dealing with worshiping these deities. And the whole point of this context is their gods you're not supposed to worship. Neither male nor female. Destroy all the altars.
Mm-hmm. But
it doesn't have anything to say about whether or not Yahweh includes female.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I just want to point out is, and I guess we're coming to the end of the meeting here, so we'll wrap it up soon. Since sacrifice is obviously a major issue when it comes to the character of our Heavenly Family, this list of 10 commandments includes laws for animal sacrifice. And so Jeremiah 7 certainly disagrees with this. So this J text is claiming that Yahweh gave commands regarding animal sacrifice in connection with the Exodus. So Jeremiah 7 is disagreeing with this. This disagrees with Jeremiah 7. Just something to keep in mind. And of course, I'll just read this little passage again in verses 19 and 20. Every firstborn of a womb is mine. Now this, in the context, it includes animals and human animals. Because it says, well, I'll just read the verse again because it says it so clearly.
I'm so glad you're commenting on this. I meant to, and I forgot.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it's
cool.
An important one.
Yeah. So every firstborn of a womb is mine, and all your animals that have a male first birth, ox or sheep. And you shall redeem an ass's first birth with a sheep. And if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. You shall redeem every firstborn of your sons, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. Okay, so it's saying, hey, all the firstborn belong to me, and that includes donkeys. And with a donkey, since it cannot be sacrificed, basically you're supposed to redeem it. In other words, you give something in place of it, so you don't have to actually take your firstborn donkey. You instead take a sheep in place of the firstborn donkey. And then it's saying you do the same thing with a human. So it says it allows you to not redeem the donkey if you don't really want to. But it says if you don't redeem it, if you don't give a sheep instead of it, you have to break its neck. So it's basically, if you won't take it to be sacrificed,
the sheep.
Yeah, if you want to take the sheep to be sacrificed in place of the donkey, then you have to kill your donkey. Then when it comes to your firstborn sons, you shall redeem every firstborn of your sons. So this is actually saying not to sacrifice your children, but it's kind of odd because it's implying that they would be sacrificed, that they are claimed as sacrifices, the firstborn sons, human sons, but that you're not supposed to do it, that you're not supposed to actually sacrifice them, you are supposed to redeem them. In other words, you bring a sheep or something instead. Now, it's really interesting when you compare the laws in this covenant code in J with the covenant code in E that we read. Because if you notice, they have a lot of the same commands, keeping the 3 annual pilgrimage feasts, the 7th-day Sabbath. They both include the command, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. They have a lot of parallel. In J, this list of 10 commandments is the words of the covenant. In E, the list of commands that it gave in Exodus chapters 21 to 23, that is referred to as the scroll of the covenant. So it seems to be like alternate versions of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel, and they have overlapping commands with each other. So you might say these are 2 independent witnesses, potentially, to that covenant. Now, it's really interesting because in the E version, it actually contains the command that every firstborn shall be mine. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick. That's kind of a larger section to quickly skim, but it has that command that every firstborn. Oh, yeah, found it. It's in Exodus chapter 22, verse 28. You shall give me the firstborn of your sons. And then the next command is, you shall do this to your ox and to your sheep. 7 days it will be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. So it's kind of interesting because it's like, you shall give me your firstborn sons, and you shall do this to your sheep, your ox and your sheep.
This one doesn't give any qualification for redeeming it with a different animal.
Right.
Redeeming your son.
Exactly. And so, you shall not eat meat in the field. Okay, yeah. So it's kind of like, if these animals that are supposed to be given to Yahweh in chapter 22, verse 29, if they're given to him as sacrificial animals, and what else does it mean to give it to Yahweh? Good question. Then when it says you shall give me your firstborn sons, it doesn't make any qualifier. It's just in the same context. Is this a law that's actually requiring the sacrifice of human firstborn sons?
Is this where circumcision came from on the 8th day? Instead of killing the son, you just cut off the foreskin?
That's a good question. That's an excellent question.
Maybe they decided, no, I want this kid, so we'll just do this instead. But other nations circumcised, not just the Israelites.
Right, but maybe even this law about the firstborn son, because human sacrifice was widespread among many cultures, and in fact, it seemed to be an almost universal practice, human sacrifice, along with animal sacrifice. And it may be that this law, like we could look this up to see if this law actually is just a repeat from older laws from other nations, but maybe that does give some insight into the origins of circumcision.
Which would also be kind of interesting. Well, this might be getting off in the weeds a little bit, but just how we're not supposed to, well, I'm trying to phrase it accurately. In the New Testament, Paul's talking about how you don't have to be circumcised in order to receive the covenant and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely, Paul actually has some things that might be at least come across negative concerning circumcision. And in the gospel according to the Hebrews, Jesus isn't positive towards circumcision. And I think there's a statement in the Gospel of Thomas where someone asks Jesus if we ought to be circumcised, and he basically says, look, if we were meant to be circumcised, we'd be born circumcised, or something like that. Like, hey, we're born with, males are born with foreskins, and that's a good thing. So he seemed to be opposed to circumcision, at least in that saying attributed to Jesus. But here, it's really interesting how it seems like this 10 Commandments in J and this covenant scroll in E may actually be 2 versions of the same thing, which would show that there had been a dramatic editorial process because they are radically different from each other, but they serve the same function in their respective texts. In other words, the J 10 Commandments serves the same function in it as the E scroll of the covenant serves in it. in E. So really, really kind of interesting. In some ways, in many ways, J's version seems to be a moral improvement upon the E version, even though it still has sacrificing, slaughtering animals, breaking a donkey's neck. And by the way, in ancient Canaan, pre-Israel, there were sacrifices of donkeys, and it was always for something specific. I forget what it was, but some scholar talks about it in the UCSD lectures for the Exodus conference. So I just wanted to mention that in case you guys want to search for that. But, at least it doesn't have actually sacrificing humans here in the J version, and it doesn't command a genocide for the people in the land of Canaan, nor does it even say that God is going to kill them like it does in E. So in any case, I'm not trying to justify the immorality in either of these, but just comparing them and noting that the morality present in E seems to be more extreme to the negative as compared to J. And anyway, I hope that kind of that analysis is helpful for everyone here in giving you guys something to build upon in investigating it further. So anyway, we've been on now for an hour and 10 minutes, and we should probably bring the meeting to an end. Does anyone have anything that they're just dying to say? And if not, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I just want to say, I can't help but think back to Abraham sacrificing Isaac. I don't know, that my mind's just going that way to see if there's any relation to all this with that act back then. And I'm kind of wondering now what source that story was from too. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say before we close off.
That's a great question. I'll briefly comment on it. If I remember correctly, it is in the E source where Abraham is told he's supposed to sacrifice Isaac.
Well, that fits since the E source seems to promote human sacrifice.
Right. And the other thing that I'll say, there are many scholars who argue that there is a tradition among ancient Israel where Abraham sacrificed Isaac, where Isaac wasn't redeemed at the end. That there are ancient sources that basically just talk about Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and just as though it actually happened that way. So anyway, I'm not familiar enough with the subject to know whether there actually is such a tradition in ancient Israel, whether there actually are a group of texts that say that Abraham sacrificed Isaac. But I just wanted to let you know that that is a scholarly contention, and that if you look into it, you'll probably be able to find something, at least scholars claiming that to be the case and giving arguments as to why they think that that was the case. And some argue that that was the earlier tradition, that Abraham actually sacrificed Isaac, and then the later one is when Israel veered away from human sacrifice but still maintained the tradition. So they altered it to make it less objectionable to their own ears. Those are all possibilities, things to consider and study and whatever.
But as we said in recent studies previously, how it just doesn't really seem to make sense for God to say, I'm going to test you, Abraham. In his mind, he's thinking, I'm going to test Abraham, see if he's willing to obey me, even though I ask him to do something immoral. Oh, now I know that you're willing to follow any command I give you, no matter how atrocious. Okay, cool, you're all good. Like, that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's not a plus for God. It's not a plus for Abraham, even in the scenario where Isaac isn't sacrificed.
Mm-hmm.
Who is actually learning anything from that? What is being learned that Abraham's willing to kill someone because he's told to? Like, that's not positive. So anyway, Yeah, okay. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we'll end?
I will. Heavenly Family, we're so happy that you are all about morality and love. And we just pray that you keep guiding us and leading us to the truth of all this and getting to the bottom of this whole search of your character. And we know that we will arrive at righteousness no matter what. So be with us now. We thank you. In the name of Branch, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Love you all lots, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow night's meeting. So, shalom.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.